a basic theory of interest really starts with our interests and why we're interested. Exploring interests through our direct experiences when we're interested in something, and also recognizing the states in which we're not interested in, and what's that like. Exploring the nature of that in relation to interests, and engaging in our interests, how they differ, how these experiential modes of our existing that have these continuous states of experience that have the same characteristics and properties that characterize them in terms of how they feel and basic aspects of information that relate directly to our knowledge and our ways of knowing that are unique to us as individuals and pertain to how the psychological mind learns. And not just learns in both these universal but also individually different and personalizable ways with specified characteristics and particular ways of approaching situations that are unique to individuals and that individually differ but also have similarities and in some cases the same properties, in which we can uncover and deepen our understandings of what truly characterizes these learning processes, what describes them and helps to explain causal patterns, and also optimal states of learning that pertain to our direct interests and meaningful processing that must occur in relation and to constitute interest and taking interest in anything at all, because it wouldn't be interesting if it wasn't meaningful to us as individuals and it didn't resonate on an emotional level that has a satiating qualia to it in relation to what's going on in terms of gratifying our ego and providing direct rewards in terms of dopamine release and serotonin that's pertaining to the neuromodulation of a feel-good sensation in relation to our interests, and which predominantly focuses on both the release of dopamine but also acetylcholine that's important for that release and neurotransmission and conductivities that are concurrent to the release of various chemically based proteins that are synthesizing information direct to the qualia and encoding for the subject matter within the nervous system, engaged in these dynamical bodily substantive processes which instantiate meaning in the form of psychological information within psychological functional structures that are bodily dynamic and relate directly to the environment and are embedded within physical structures in which we endow meaning. And through our embeddedness and physicality, and particularly the surrounds of our consciousness, that the psychological mind is bound to and is boundless as well in relation to the infinite possibilities and potentials for our subjective experience to consider and contemplate and to think up and to ideate on, and through our imaginative consciousness consider all the complexities and facets of our interests that complexify our interests into more complicated emotions through these constructive combination of working psychological and physical structural functional parts that form these constitutions of operational nuclei and module houses that storages information in regards to meaningful processing, storage house inning what is not just matterful in terms of a concrete, physical, dynamical law sense that pertains to these functional structures and properties of existence that have direct physicalities and reciprocal relations modeled internal to these psychological processings that enable any sort of modality as a system in which performs a set of purposing functions that have associated purposes but are also optimistically optimized to be expansive and adapt to the surrounds in ways that tend to individually differ from other organisms at the benefit of the individual organism, in which is deciphering and ciphering information in various routes and directions, and particularly two oppositional directions that pertain to an internal and external, but also a distinction of the internal and external that's represented within the psychological mind, and can discern and recognize the subjective experiencer as distinct from other aspects of the environment, and requires a finite set of sources in the form of physical metabolites to function at all, and must ate to be able to do anything and supply fuel that's distinct from the energy that is recognized directly through qualia, and pertains more to this direct sense of direction and energization in a direction. Energization defined as performing a function in association to a process with a degree of health or functionality to it. And functionality and health are a marker here of being able to metabolize anything in relation to a process that works or does not work. And therefore we can define it as being a valid existing functional process or not. And if it's not, then maybe it's a functional process prospectively, or potential functional process that's currently dysfunctional, or maybe it's not even a process. And if it's not even a process, then we have to explore the reasons why we're even considering it or characterizing it, and it could pertain to more of these subject matter illusions of our own subjective experience that are components of the psychological, operational, and functional healthy mind, in terms of considering what's true and not, what's perceptual, what's just imagined, what's thought up, in terms of actually trying to consider and obtain what's true and understand it more firmly, not just perceive it as something that we think it to be true, but it's not true, and then we come to believe it, and that can produce a whole bunch of issues that are a matter of direct concern to us. But that's not necessarily the same thing as perceiving something to be meaningful, because what's meaningful pertains more to these subjective psychological processes that are more complicated in the organism. I, that is also the body, or including referring to dynamical body and behavioral causal aspects of the I. Consciousness that is more perceptual and part of the causal end of a cognitive, self-directed, and agentic causal operating system, in which we can well define various aspects of individual agents in terms of having volitional psychological minds and consciousnesses of their own, with distinctive awarenesses and a sense of what's right or wrong in direct relation to qualia and their understanding and knowledge of their own self-virtues and strengths, and also what constitutes good character or a positive role model that models the works of great thinkers, either through the intellect or through virtue, and self-virtue in particular, that's exemplifying the characteristics of what individuals have deemed great throughout history and time, and with consideration for various intersecting distinctive topics of studies or subject matters that span any potential subject matter, discipline, or field of study, be it scientific or natural, philosophical, or even psychological. And that can also include subject matter that's not necessarily captured fully by the intellect, such as the subject matter that arises and is synthesized and must be synthesized within the imaginative consciousness of individuals, that is innate to all individuals, in which expands learning through what could not otherwise exist and is unique and originates from the mind of individually different individuals, and is necessary also for a gooder consciousness and to think independently and to freely express the true virtues and the true good conscious of the self through an individual's direct interests in engaging in the world and engaging particularly meaningfully in the world, and not just thoughtfully in the sense that we're expressing our know-how and our knowledge of things, though that's essential too and can't be easily parsed out from doing any sort of good, because we have to actually establish what's good in something that's more objective rather than less subjective, even when we're operating on purely subjective terms, we could say, because the expressions of our character in relation to how we behave in terms of what's more essential in regards to our self-expressions and our free expressions of the self that represent the self, much as the characters oriented towards expanding the grandeurs the self can access through what is represented but not the self, and is rather the collection of good forthcomings and putting forth of the self to exemplify the best version of the self and to provide the best possible role model to others in the situations that require it most, and when it is suited and necessary, to be able to reduce suffering that is unnecessary, potentially eliminate unnecessary harm or the frequency of it, to regulate or deter it, but also more importantly to do what makes virtues in and of themselves, which pertains to a whole set of varying categories of effects that are generally positive and tend to benefit individuals by providing access to goods or necessities in relation to information or positive affects that regulate well-being or promote positivity and positive well-being, or inspire individuals to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, through exemplifying the traits and the qualities that tend to lead to optimal physical or positive psychological functioning. And in addition to that, also to be able to establish more universal and objective principles, laws, and descriptions and explanations for why specific psychological dynamics are orthogonal, as in oppositional to what promotes the optimums of well-being and optimal health and good functioning, healthy minds and bodies, so physical and psychological health and well-being, in relation to also how we subjectively feel in our subjective well-being from the experience of right now, its levels of intensity that can be sometimes overwhelming, through psychological distress that often we can tone down when we can tap into the strengths in the qualities of our direct experiences. And sometimes that's found within our own self and our recognition of our own virtue strengths that are unique to us as individuals and pertain directly to an innate self-virtuousness that exists with any individual who has a conscience or a desire for good and conscience, or to create and synthesize their conscience through whatever volitional capacity or agency they have, or even sense of agency that really allows for that free expression to exist through any sort of thought, even the conception of or wanting or crave of it, that can allow for thinking. And if an individual earnestly engages the world, that is, that they seek out what's truly true and not just perceived as true, and they're honest in their efforts in terms of actually doing something good or aligned with a particular strength or virtue that promotes greater health or psychological well-being. Through this could be in the form of learning, providing high quality access to knowledge or novel information, or distinctive information that is not just informative but useful and can benefit individuals in various situations, day-to-day situations, even in the now or current situation, or future moments and future experiences that can range from any possible situation and event and pertain to any particular activity, or even how they can recognize their strengths or strengthen their strengths through engaging interests and exploring their interests and finding what's meaningful to us as individuals, and learning how our minds and bodies work and operate less effectively but also more effectively, and how when we are immersed in what we're doing, we tend to be also absorbing more information and also synthesizing more information, ultimately learning more and coming to know more and deepen our understandings, but also coming to deepen our ignorance and understandings of what we don't know and the limits of our knowledge, which can be more expansive in terms of teaching us how to explore what we don't know in relation to what we know, to be able to actually know what we know and know what we don't know, and to be able to make more precise and accurate our approximations from our perceptions, as well as our instantiations of explanation or speculation involving what is required to be true, and not just true, but truly true and truly known. And it's more of these truly known speculative truths that are more important to being able to do anything functionally, because this is how we operate in the world and engage with anything. And if we're just going around thinking or perceiving the world as if we know it to be a certain way and think it to be a certain way and truly believe it to be a certain way, but if it's not a certain way, we end up experiencing these high states of negative affect or psychological distress that are destabilizing and dysfunctional and compromise our physical health and our psychological health. And we know this when we're not functional, and we can recognize through our direct self-subjective experiences these dysfunctional states, and we tend to express those more in terms of panic or psychological distress that impede certain essential functions such as eat or sleep or any sort of motion, physical motion, like walking. If you can't walk and do something that is often necessary to be able to support any function of the body, even just to maintain various muscles and psychological structures, we need to have stimulation across the nervous system. Otherwise, the body gradually and can eventually hit periods in which it quite quickly begins to enter states of disease or illness or dysfunction that are increased when we're sedentary and we don't do anything. And when we're more wakeful and interested and immersed in our surroundings, this provides more heat and generation of these conductivities that are operating through the physical stimulations of our body, which require aids to metabolize things and to ingest and digest, supplying the fuel sources to different areas that would otherwise be inactive if we didn't task or self-task and create this necessity, this essential aspect that is essential and also necessary for our mind to be and body to be functional and healthy at all, and which require us to not just be volitional but to be conscious and form a degree of our own sense of responsibility that's strict and direct to ourselves and does not pertain to others, and which is more bound to this need to gratify the ego and necessity for that, and essential process that requires us to do everything that is necessary for our subjective existence to continue and to exist at all and to function not just exist, but to function optimally, not just to function but yes, to function good enough, but there is also, through the evolutionary dynamics, a higher desire, particularly that's unique to us with larger brains and higher complex cognitive capacities that individually distinguish us from other species, interested in more than good enough and abundance that to some extent does exist in other species and across all automaton that are interested in abundance and optimization of certain processes, but not necessarily the finer qualities and the more unique creative meanings and purposes that arise from these good enough necessities and needs and essential metabolites that are necessary to sustain our whole psychological dynamic operating system that is more complex than just the mind, but encompasses a nervous system within a surround and that has to operate within a time space in relation to events and other structures and ultimately other minds too. So here's an interesting thought. We can't just exist as a sole independent consciousness, and nor could it be the case that everything was just one single consciousness. There has to be these distinct individuals with individual differences in terms of also interest in what's being processed in the mind, in which this particular mind has interests that are specialized and individually different from others, but also shares a set of universal interests and common interests that are where we also can understand the physical and the psychological laws and dynamics, and also where we can gather the materials for developing theories and explanations, but also speculating and forming true knowledge, and true knowledge through representative categoricals of information that are gathered through our direct sensors and preceptors, providing information that is either confirmatory or can disconfirm and rule out possibilities, but also form conclusions and conclusive possibilities, but also actual cases and what's really the case, and really truly the case, that forms these truly known categories of existence that are validated through our direct experiences, but also through indirect methods such as science or natural philosophy and philosophizing that can render truths in through the direct encounters of subjective materials being processed in the mind, with direct considerations for subjective and objective relationships that are well defined and would have to, through description and explanation in its context and situated intended manner and philosophization as regarding the ways of knowing that specify clearly why something is true and why it would be known, because it pertains directly to information that is objective and more objective rather than subjective, and can be explained as such, and explained well with good enough clear descriptions that we can make sense of. And this helps us to form well-known categories of truth, but also what's truly known, and what's truly known, which is necessary for speculation and also learning and exploring our interests and engaging more deeply in our interests that have a way of positively optimizing the endeavors for our existence, in which might not at the inception of them in intercepting of the psychological information regarding the meaningfulness and thought that's bound to representers and representations of symbolic thought in forms of semanticizations, that is, in terms of thought that comes in the forms of words or thinking that has meaningful lexical associations that can also be associated with pictures or visual images or direct experiences involving touch and grasping, and direct visual experiences and auditory experiences and smells and multisensory experiences and all kinds of thinking, including using the imagination, and even not even thinking about what's directly in the environment, but simply just being in your head and imagining what tends to also produce positive emotion. You can be in a place but in your head in a completely different space, yet present and being able to process the physical sense experiences of your surrounds, yet bifurcate that and abstract that out into an imaginative consciousness or a plane of the psychological mind that has these translucent elements but is also more direct to our thinking processes and all thinking processes and all perceptual processes, in which we can be present to our physical surrounds, or we can be more internal to what's occurring through our psychological, more direct experiences, and our direct experiences that pertain to information processing and our direct psychological information experiences that can only be generated through the psychological mind of the mind. And it's through this mind of the minding mind that we tend to understand our interests in its most deepest, individually different form and way, through often channels of introspection that are beneath the skin and which span throughout the circuitry of our existence. And these psychological fireworks of activity that are festivals of meaningfulness and purposefulness, with different sensoriums of meaning to be explored and engaged in, and ways of really taking interest in all matters of things.